Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the audio lecture on early Greek and Aegean art. With this lecture, we're going to be looking at the time period before the days of classical Greek style, which is most familiar. The high classical Greek period started in about 400 BC, and we'll be beginning, at about 2000 BC. So what we're looking at here is called the bull leaping, and this is from the island of Crete, from the Minoan capital, or the Minoan palace of Knossos. And this palace has given us great glimpses into what the life of the ancient Minoan people would have been like. With the study of Greece, we begin a new phase in our study of art. Unlike some of the art that we have looked at so far, the influences of the ancient Greeks are so pervasive in our current society that we may not even notice them. One example would be most downtown areas, all across America, include buildings that reflect Greek influence, and the same is true of the government housed within many of these buildings. The government was structured on ideas originally presented by the Greeks. We also see Greek architecture in banking because it is supposed to give a great feeling of stability. In most people's understanding, there is civilization and then there is culture. And in our current time, the two can be quite distinct from each other. We'll call civilization our practical and our social way of life, while culture is the intellectual and artistic expression. Artists and intellectuals can tend to be on the fringes of our modern society, and some of you might have looked at this when considering what you're going to have for your major. Even if you have an interest in art, that's a big commitment. This split between art and everyday life is actually very recent. It occurred gradually over the last few hundred years, and yet in our current era it's accepted as fact. The Greeks, they held a different view. Artists and intellectuals were central to Greek society. Greeks believed that humans are capable of achieving an idealized state of being, and this state, this high ideal, was expressed in their art. Unlike the Egyptians, the Greeks believed in the power of individual expression. They believed that each person has a unique voice, and by pursuing their own personal best, a person could create innovation and thus further society overall. This optimistic belief resulted in an explosion of creative and scientific pursuits that came to height over a period of about 200 years during what is called the Golden Age of Greece. This began around 400 to 500 BC. During this brief period of time, the foundation was laid for the standards of art and beauty that we still consider true to this day. This belief in the power of the individual was also a big influence on the Renaissance. In fact, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and it refers to a rebirth of the classical Greek thought, which we'll be studying in the next few weeks. Let's begin by going back to the Aegean island cultures. The roots of ancient Greece go back to a group of small islands off the coast of the mainland, known as the Aegean Islands. Beginning about 3000 BC, these islands were the home of very sophisticated cultures. The largest of these islands was the island of Crete, with a group of islands called the Cyclades scattered around it. On the mainland of Greece, there was also a culture known as the Mycenaean. And it's very interesting when we compare the Mycenaean and what we will call the Minoan culture, which was on Crete, because they were really different types of people. The Aegean people were herders, farmers, traders, and artisans. Their close proximity to the sea gave rise to an active trade across cultures. They were known far and wide for their expert bronze work and exported armor and tools to Egypt and across the Persian Empire. These islanders built vast palace complexes that show a Persian influence, except unlike the Persians, these palaces are more open, allowing for the nice, cool sea breeze to blow through. There are lower ceilings, and the style of decoration is quite elaborate, perhaps reflecting the temperate climate and easy life of the Aegean islanders. One of the islands in this chain is known as Thera, and it's believed by some to be the home of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Or maybe we could say that perhaps the earthquake that buried Thera gave rise to all of the legends of the lost city of Atlantis. In ancient times, the island of Thera nourished a very advanced culture. Then around 1600 BC, a large volcanic mountain that dominated the island erupted, and more than half of the land went into the sea. This is actually seen by many to be the largest volcanic eruption ever recorded by humans. Since the people of the Aegeans were prehistoric in that they left no written record, we're really left to look at what they did leave behind to create our own stories of this advanced and mysterious culture. Let's look at the map, shall we? So here's what we have is Anatolia, here's the Peloponnese island, and here's the area that we'll be looking at. Here's Crete, the Cyclades, and here we have the Mycenaean area here. So you see it's a fairly small chain of islands, and yet it had tremendous influence on the ancient world because of its proximity to all these other countries. It was a trading center and a shipping center, and they developed great skills as artisans that really spread throughout the ancient world. The island people had a very unique aesthetic style that's really reflected in abstract art of the early 20th century. The two figures on the right are a good example of this. Sculptures similar to these figures were found in great numbers all over the islands. They range in size from just a few inches high to over 5 feet tall. And they're all very similar to the ones shown here, made in a certain kind of a perfect proportion with really no expression on the face and a real stylization and simplification of the form. Originally, these sculptures were brightly painted with facial features, hair, and ornamentation. Above here on this page to the left is a sculpture that's known as the harp player, and I admit I just love this. When you think of it as an early sculpture from 2500 BC, it's quite sophisticated in its design. Notice the simple lines throughout, and also look at how the artist has made much use of the negative space. That would be all these areas that are not sculpted, where the positive space, the sculpture itself, makes these shapes of air that are quite pleasing to the eye. This is also revolutionary, this particular sculpture, because it's in the round, which means that it can be viewed from all sides. This is something that we had not seen very much in the ancient world up to this point. Now, this sculpture in the middle above is from the 1900s, created by the artist Modigliani, and this reflects the influences of the earlier Cycladic work. The simplified lines of the earlier works, which are over 4,000 years old, had an obvious influence on the work of this artist, and really on the work of many others from the early 20th century. Let's look at the palace at Knossos. The people of the Aegean islands built grand palace complexes. The most famous of these is the palace at Knossos on the island of Crete. This 6-acre complex had paved streets, advanced water systems, and even sewers, complete with terracotta pipes that ran under the palace floors. The palace was first rebuilt after an earthquake around 1700 BC and went on to become a rich trading center. Archaeologists exploring this site found enough storage jars to hold 20,000 gallons of olive oil. I find that pretty amazing when you think about just the vast quantity. The palace was protected by its complicated layout. In fact, our modern word, labyrinth, which can mean a maze, comes from an ancient name for this city. If an enemy were attempting to enter the city, they would quickly find themselves lost in the maze of confusing passages and hallways. Above left, we have the bull rhyton, which was designed to have liquid, wine, or blood poured into the top in order to come out of the mouth. And this is from the palace at Knossos. And here we have, in the lower left, part of the restored interior that tells us what it may have looked like when it was inhabited. In fact, much of the palace has been restored. Here we have the Queen's throne room from Knossos, and it provides us with an idea of what the palace may have been like. There was a British man named Sir Arthur Evans working around 1900, and he made it his life's work to restore this palace to its original splendor. In modern-day archaeological circles, his actions are controversial, not always winning approval, because the current methodology is to leave archaeological sites much as they were found, rather than trying to restore them. However, because Mr. Evans was inspired to do this, we do have a small taste of the palace's original splendor. And now just imagine, here we have an artist's rendering of a palace from mainland Greece around 1300 BC. It shows how the people of the era decorated every possible inch of their working and living spaces. In looking at this particular image, one can imagine the sea breeze blowing through open walls and the easy, abundant life that the people of the time experienced. Let's talk a little bit more about the people of mainland Greece, known as the Mycenaeans. Their character was really quite different than the island cultures, and this maybe makes sense, because they were living on rocky soil. They were much more isolated, and they surrounded their palaces with thick walls and protected gates. The treasury of Atreus, seen above, and the wall around the palace to the left are both examples of the great building skills of the Mycenaeans. And they're both from around 1300 BC. One extraordinary skill that the Mycenaeans had was their extensive use of what is called corbelled vaulting. Now, to do this, they would be stacking heavier rocks towards the center to build an arch with no mortar at all. Now, if you look carefully at the treasury here, you can see that the corbelled vaulting goes all the way up to the top. This is truly masterful, and yet when it's working best, one might not notice. I wonder how they would work with the levees, with the pulleys and levers, in order to raise these very heavy stones up overhead and secure them in place. Now, here's a theory that I have, but I've seen it play out throughout history, and that is that there have always been these time periods of roughly 150 to 200 years. And during these times, human culture has made great advances after being relatively stagnant for a long time. So here we can look at Egyptian culture, which remained basically unchanged for thousands of years. And then at a certain time in Greece, over a period of 150 to 200 years, there occurred profound changes that are still reflected in our lives today. This phenomenon has been repeated in the Renaissance, where again there was a great leap of science, art, and culture over a period of about 150 years. And I suppose one could assume, with the technological revolution of this day, that we are again in one of those time periods where the structure of human society is fundamentally changing at a very accelerated rate over a relatively short time period. So here we have a grave marker called a stela from the period just at the beginning of the high classical era of Greece. And this is a Roman reproduction of a Greek mosaic called the unswept floor. Now, if I had this as my floor, it might drive me a little crazy, but can you see the mouse? I think that shows that even the ancient Greeks did have a sense of humor. Although Greek civilization can be traced back to 1100 BC, our study will begin about 100 years after the first Olympic Games, which were held in 776 BC. At the time, around 600 BC, the city of Athens along the coast began to gain prominence in the region. At around the same time, Athens began its experiments in democracy, which were somewhat limited because they only included land-holding males who were citizens of Athens. So if you were a woman, or darker complected, or a slave, you did not get the vote. But at least they had the idea of democracy and began to put it into play. Like the Egyptians and the Persians, the people of ancient Greece worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses. But unlike these other ancient civilizations, the gods and goddesses of the Greeks had human attributes. The Greek people built great temples for their gods, and this is where we find most of the artwork that we will be studying. Other sources of Greek art include Roman copies of Greek statues. The Romans greatly admired Greek artworks, and much of what has survived is actually Roman copies, most especially the bronze statues, because in ancient times bronze was prized for military purposes. Often great works of art were melted down and reformed for weapons. We're also fortunate to have the writings of the ancient Greeks, because these are the first people to write at length about their artists, and these artists were highly respected members of society. The Greek people believed strongly in the power of the individual to achieve some kind of perfection, leading to a climate of innovation, resulting in advances in science, government, and philosophy, as well as in art. One product of this fertile time was Aesop, the author of Aesop's fables. Now, Aesop was a slave who told his morality tales with animal characters while he was working on a Greek island around 450 BC. Another product of this time was the poet Sappho. She was a woman poet who wrote exquisite love poems. They really make sense still to this day. Now, she was a very rare person in that the women in ancient Greek society did not have much standing at all. There was much more inclusion of women in the Roman society, which we'll study next. There are three primary phases of Greek sculpture. They're known as the Archaic period, from about 600 BC to 480 BC. The Classical period, which lasted from 480 BC to 323 BC, and the Hellenistic period, which began with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and lasted until about 100 BC, when Rome began to come to prominence. The archaic, or old style, is characterized by stiff frontal poses, as we see here. Now you can easily remember archaic is the old style because arch means old, as in archaeology. This oldest style of the three phases of Greek art is characterized by stiff frontal poses. And here we see a comparison with Egyptian and archaic art. You can see that they actually look very similar. A comparison of the male figure here and of this Koros figure look very similar. Now, with the classical period, artistic expression radically changed. The classical figure in the middle above here looks much more naturalistic than we see with the archaic figure. And yet it represents an idealization of the human form. In fact, this particular sculpture, this singular sculpture, known as the Doryphorus man or the spear bearer, became what we call the canon of proportion for the Greeks. In other words, other figures that were styled after this sculpture was made were used this as a model of what the perfect human would look like. This guy is 7.5 heads tall. He has a sort of a physique, and he's frozen forever around the age of 18, which is part of the idealization that the Greeks used in their art. Now, while this is still idealized, when we get to the Hellenistic style, art became much more emotional, sensual, and dramatic. There is a thread of realism that also runs through this time period. As Athens moved out of its golden age, the classical period, into a time with the Hellenistic period of disillusionment and uncertainty. So for our final slide, let's consider what it might have really looked like. If you look at Greek art today, it's easy to imagine that it was all unpainted and probably broken. But if we consider what it would have looked like in its day, when the great Parthenon was painted and had gold leaf throughout, when these old female sculptures that were goddesses were painted with these elaborate forms. And lastly, when these great warriors adorned gold and silver helmets. So as you go through the study of Greek and Aegean art, I invite you to imagine the colorful paints that would have been applied to these ancient relics at the time that they were used. And we'll continue this in the next audio lecture. But for now, I hope your imagination is sparked, and I just want to say thank you for listening.